The Labour Party conference is retreating behind us, but the rows rumble on. We will be putting one of those rows under the microscope today on The Briefing and exposing more than a couple of hypocrites. The Tory conference starts this weekend as the Prime Minister and his party descend on Manchester for their annual gathering. It will in some respects be the Prime Minister's first proper conference as party leader. In 2020, COVID cancelled the in-person event, and in 2019, a Supreme Court ruling ended recess, returning MPs to Parliament, meaning the conference was a little thin on the ground. Well, this year the Prime Minister faces some challenges on energy prices soaring, HGV drivers, hospital backlogs, and of course the manifesto-busting tax rises. Well, today the energy price cap is to go up, and that's to some way to catch up with the rise in wholesale prices. It will affect millions. The Prime Minister will have a tough job juggling all of these issues. We'll speak to an expert pollster later in the show, both on how Sir Keir did at his conference and what Boris can do at his. Elsewhere, the longest-serving female MP, Harriet Harman, has called for the Met Police Commissioner's resignation yesterday after the clear failures within her organisation. Meanwhile, the government is issuing her a 2-year contract. We'll be keeping a close eye on this story as it develops. And of course, in Scotland, vaccine passports are being introduced today. We'll be talking to a member of the Scottish Parliament about what that all means. You're watching The Briefing. Now, one row that upset the Labour Party conference this week was over the argument of a £15 minimum wage. The Momentum campaign group is backing it. Former Shadow Cabinet Minister Andy MacDonald resigned over it, and Sir Keir's refusal to back it was one of the reasons a founding union of the Labour Party disaffiliated this week. It was the subject of a lot of the heckles in Starmer's speech. It's clear why Starmer isn't backing it, though. The setting the minimum wage at £15 an hour annualised is £31,100 a year. That's right, the smallest wage anyone would be allowed to be paid in the country would be over £31,000 a year. It's clear to see how job-destroying that would be, and we'll get to that later. But curiously, it appears as if those campaigning for that wage understand how difficult it would be to implement themselves and how there would be many fewer jobs off the back of it. Indeed, many of those organisations campaigning for this new wage don't pay it themselves. Well, joining me now is someone who's been digging into this story. Christian Calgi is the senior reporter for the Guido Fawkes website, and you've been digging around some of these organisations that have been campaigning for this wage hike, but don't pay it themselves.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? You really got the sense that they were spoiling for some sort of tangible policy fight. And what they focused in on was this £15 minimum wage, which has almost sort of come out of nowhere. They've gone from wanting a £10 minimum wage, and then the blink of an eye, they've hiked it all the way up to £15, which would pull the rug out of under the feet of so many businesses. And some of the biggest cheerleaders for this were a group called Novara Media, who many watchers will probably not know, but they are a Corbynite blog. They love Jeremy.
It's where the Ash Sarkars of this world come from.
Exactly, they might know Ash Sarkar, indeed. And they were back in January advertising £12.50 for a job.
So I think we've got a bit of a graphic of that we can show the viewers at home. This is an advert from Novara Media for someone to work for their organisation. There it is, £12.50 an hour, a full £2.50 less than they're calling the government to mandate. And this was in January this year.
Well, exactly. I mean, that would look rather generous if they'd stuck to the £10 an hour minimum wage. But the moment that they shot up to £15, it completely undid them. And Novara were clearly furious. I mean, we put this investigation out, we put this article out, and my goodness, there were flows of tweets coming through from Ash Sarkar and other people in the organisation screaming at us for pointing this hypocrisy out. Now, they claim miraculously that they have in fact just increased the minimum wage offering.
Just now?
Just now increased it, yes, to £15. And indeed, it might be raising to £16.50. So, if we've played our little part in that, then I'm delighted.
But can I just ask, since that last advert where they advertised for £12.50 an hour, Have there been any other adverts to prove that they've been paying £15 an hour since?
Funnily enough, I've not been sent any. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to send some our way if that were the case.
But they're not the only organisation that isn't living up to what they're demanding.
No, absolutely not. We had, as you alluded to, the Bakers Union caused an upset this week when they disaffiliated from the Labour Party and absolutely slammed Keir Starmer, taking Andy McDonald's side on this £15 minimum wage row. Indeed, I think they've actually been campaigning for it for a number of years now. And lo and behold, they also, we found, an advert offering much less than £15 an hour.
I think we can have a look at that advert now too. Here it is, the Bakers Union being affiliated with another group paying just £12 an hour whilst campaigning for £15 an hour. Pretty extraordinary.
It's totally brazen, isn't it? I mean, what more can you say? And these weren't, this didn't require a sort of Watergate-level investigation. These were quite readily available adverts. And indeed, you've got all sorts of London waiting offers and all sorts. And even then, they were still coming under the £15 an hour.
That's extraordinary. But there was a campaign group that was born out of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign back in 2015 called Momentum. Most people will probably have heard of it. They were encouraging people to heckle Keir Starmer, calling for a £15 an hour minimum wage. But you found something about them too.
We have indeed. Well, talking of London waitings, if you would like to go and be Momentum's head of social media or something of the like, what you're going to find is if you live in London, you're going to be offered about £14.50. Yeah. If you live in the provinces, if you're not lucky enough to be a member of the metropolitan Liberal elite, then you are going to be paid about £12.60 for working for Momentum.
I think we can see a bit of the copy from your website now up on the screen. I'm not sure if we can. OK, I'm afraid we can't see that.
What a shame.
It's £12.62 in the provinces that they're paying, which is really quite a bit below £15 an hour.
It is, and I think it's also worth mentioning that, of course, while Keir Starmer doesn't back £15 an hour on a national basis, we have seen photographs and videos from 2019 of him campaigning for £15 an hour for McDonald's staff, but then he had to tell Sky's Beth Rigby that whilst he supports it for McDonald's, it wouldn't be appropriate to implement nationwide. Those economies don't ramp up.
I think it was also true that people working in the conference centre, where the Labour Party held their conference, were on less than 50. So Keir thinks that McDonald's workers should earn more than the people that are keeping him safe.
Yes, indeed. The people who are facilitating the Labour Party members' debates about what the minimum wage should be were actually on about £9.50 an hour. They were even less than the £10 an hour that even Keir Starmer's happy to call for. So it was a complete farce from start to finish.
What an extraordinary story. Well, Christian Calgie of the Guido Fawkes website, thank you so much for bringing us those absolute hypocrites. Well, turning to the economics of this issue now, I'm delighted to be joined by Justin Urquhart-Stewart, who is, of course, a business commentator and expert in this field, and I believe has a furry animal on his shoulder as well, some sort of cat. Marvellous stuff.
I'm stuck with a cat, I'm afraid.
Excellent, excellent. Well, firstly, I'd like to go through the issue of this £15 minimum wage, because of course this is quite a substantial amount of money. It's £31,100 a year. Would businesses be able to afford this?
Well, I think the key element is not so much per hour, that sum of 31,000. Just equate that with other levels of income people are getting. If you're a newly qualified criminal barrister, for example, you're probably not getting 31,000. So people are thinking about low-pay jobs. We've actually got very low pay throughout all sorts of areas, if you're equating sort of really rather menial tasks sometimes with highly qualified individuals. What's happened, unfortunately, is as a result of everything with regard to the pandemic, has, of course, a complete change in the entire job market and how it's going to be structured. We're in a position now, of course, we've got high levels of spare jobs going that we can't fill at the moment. We're just obviously seeing the end of furlough coming through, and a complete restructuring of the levels of employment and how people are going to be employed. Bear in mind, of course, the key area that was hit, leisure and entertainment, those are often the very lowest paid areas, and they were affected dramatically. And a lot of people did expect to actually see probably a higher level to that. But to actually put a sort of the pace of lower level barristers at the lower level of barristers I think, frankly, is pretty ludicrous.
Absolutely, and I think it probably betrays a bit of a misunderstanding of a lot of these campaigners who are probably quite privileged in and of themselves over what people live on. I've lived on much less than £30,000 a year in London before. I don't think it's a particularly base level salary at all, particularly for people who are starting out. And isn't the real issue here that putting a wage floor at that level would really hurt the youngest the most? It would be almost impossible for them to get on the jobs ladder.
It does make it very difficult indeed. And of course, the key area, which I think is important for the whole country, is the area we're trying to develop, and that is new startup companies, particularly in areas like technology. And in order to get those going, you're actually having to deploy capital, and you're working on probably very thin margins indeed. Therefore, by putting in minimum costs here at such a level, you're actually almost giving people the reason to say, I won't set up my own business now, I'll have less confidence and I'll actually, maybe I won't do it at all, or I will go elsewhere. What I mean elsewhere, because in these days of electronic, greater technology, I'll set up my business, heaven forfend, maybe in the EU, because I can actually get probably a better level there, at least for the time being, if this was to go through. So I think now, actually, think very carefully, it's not just a matter of a minimum wage, actually how viable businesses are going to be. And of course, what's the primary driver of our economy? And that is, of course, consumer expenditure. If consumer expenditure is going to be reduced because of higher costs, and part of that will be wage levels coming through, but we also see in terms of, say, we've seen the gas prices coming through, other areas, we've got input inflation probably running at over 10% at the moment. That's input, not the output inflation we get to see with the CPI, the price index, which is probably going to be rising to about 4.5%, potentially 5%. And so these high input costs are going to put people off in terms of not just actually setting up businesses, but actually also employing more people. Now, put it at another level in terms of that extra cost, then frankly, you can actually push yourself towards, well, not just a slowdown in the economy, but actually continuing a level which potentially is recessionary.
Look at those levels now, because a man called Giles Wilkes, who's a senior fellow at the IFG, has produced these graphs just yesterday. So this is a graph showing the wage distribution of how wages sit right now. And now this is what happens if you introduce a £15 minimum wage. There, you can just see absolutely all those jobs fall away. You've raised the floor at which you can afford to pay people. Does it add many jobs? No. Does it lose a lot of jobs? Absolutely. It's pretty extraordinary how some relatively serious players in the political world have been advocating this policy.
Well, those are very dramatic graphs, but like all wonderful economic graphs, you have to put that up against, what's really going on, what's going to happen. And to be truthful at the moment, nobody knows. We are in uncharted waters here, and it's a corny line to use, but we've never had a pandemic like this with a modern economy. Add to that the issues relating to Brexit, which people will no doubt overhype, but it has had an impact. Look at the supply chain issues which are working their way through. So the answer is we don't know. But the key line one should take from this is now is not the time to be putting impediments into further recruiting, into expansion. Now is the time to be encouraging further, and therefore making sure people do get effective rewards. Better to actually reward people with rising pay rather than necessarily a starting high pay level, which acts as a barrier. So it's the wrong way round.
I think that is absolutely incisive analysis there. And I do wonder why they did pick £15 an hour. I can't help but notice across the Atlantic, in the United States of America, there's a big campaign for $15 an hour minimum wage, backed by people like Bernie Sanders. And I wonder if the British left is just simply looking to America, putting copy and paste, swapping the dollar sign for the pound sign, even though the pound is a much more valuable currency, and just thinking that they can copy that campaign. I'm afraid we've run out of time on this segment, but Justin Urquhart-Stewart, thank you so much for joining us to discuss all of these issues. Really, really interesting analysis there. And I have to say, we did ask for someone from the Momentum organisation to come on to argue in favour of a £15 an hour minimum wage, but sadly, no one wanted to. We're keen to hear all perspectives here on The Briefing, so if you are busy shouting at your TV, disagreeing with me, please do get in touch. Now, moving up to Scotland. This morning, the Scottish Government has introduced COVID passports. Well, One guest now to discuss all of this is Miles Briggs, MSP, former Shadow Health Minister in Scotland, and someone who has been campaigning against their introduction. Do we have Miles Briggs, MSP? Welcome to the show, Miles.
Morning, Tom. I'm sorry I'm not joining you with any of my pets today, but it's good to see you.
Oh no, it's very, very good to see you too. I want to start off this conversation by looking at some of the confusion there's been on social media. I saw some tweets yesterday saying that the app hadn't even been published, some noise this morning that it isn't working for many people. What's going on?
Well, it's been a total farce is the one way to describe this whole situation. Late last night, literally when we were in Parliament having a vote, the government launched this app. And over the last sort of 12 hours, we've seen people try to register and it's just crashed on them. They're not being able to find their details. So it has been a farce. And I think all the warnings which we and others were putting to ministers, especially those in the industry, have come to light now because this hasn't clearly been tested. And we're expecting people to have this on their phones for events over this weekend. It's a total farce.
With people being expected to have it on their phones, that's what the messaging from the government is. But the legislation seems to be slightly different. When in terms of events actually being prosecuted for not implementing this system, that's not coming for a little while, is it?
So the government has put a delay in place, and that delay is till the 18th of this month in terms of organisations which would be prosecuted for not undertaking this legislation. But what we've seen actually is organisations emailing out to customers, for example, football clubs, suggesting this has to be on someone's phone or in paper form. So businesses who are trying to actually implement this over the weekend aren't really clear now what the government are suggesting they'll have to have in place.
I do have to ask you, though, that because the Scottish Conservative Party is being implacably opposed to the introduction of these vaccine passports north of the border, down in London, Boris Johnson announced a toolbox 2.5 weeks ago, saying that he may well introduce vaccine passports in England if things get a lot worse. Isn't that a bit of an inconsistent position?
Well, like you say, we as a party in Scotland who will make our own mind up on these issues have been against them. We've also been equally against ID cards when they were being suggested as well. But at the heart of this is actually where the governments have done two different processes. So the UK government consulted on this and decided it wasn't a good way to progress. The Scottish government didn't consult, and we find ourselves in this position today. So I think it shows you where two governments actually, when they look at this, shouldn't, the UK government's taking the right position of not progressing with this, I think.
I want to move on to one other story now, because there was a story in the Times newspaper yesterday saying that charities were blocked from criticising the SNP under funding deals. We can see the headline there in the online edition of the Times. Can you just explain what on earth is going on here?
Yeah, this is a deeply concerning development we've seen, and it's actually going back, I think, to the referendum when a lot of organisations did come under pressure not to speak out against Scottish independence, and we've seen that even to this day taken forward. And sadly, charities in Scotland now, as part of their funding, are being asked to sign gagging clauses so they wouldn't criticise policies of the Scottish government. Now, I think that's totally wrong. We need to have critical friends. Every government needs to actually sometimes be put on the spot by charities and organisations. And so I'm deeply concerned that this is something the Scottish government are trying to do to charities in Scotland.
It's extraordinary that if you're given money from the SNP, there's some sort of gagging clause attached. Is it any wonder then that many charities are scared to speak out against what the SNP is doing?
Absolutely. And, I've been in MSP for just over 5 years now, and I've noticed in the time I've served as MSP working with charities, they are sometimes concerned to criticise ministers, especially around when funding's being announced, because we have sadly in Scotland see charities which are very vocal against the Scottish government losing their funding. And actually just the sort of threat of ministers picking up the phone to them sometimes to say they're not concerned, as they're very concerned about what's being said about the government. So I think it is a real issue that we need to actually look at as a parliament, actually. It's something I would like to see Audit Scotland and others look at to really see how much this has been going on in the country over the last decade and a half.
Really serious issue, and one that no doubt we will keep our eyes on closely. Miles Briggs, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing on GB News this morning. Now, on the 15th of September 2021, the headline of The Guardian newspaper read, "Act urgently or face up to 7,000 a day in hospital," scientists tell PM. We were warned that the UK is now at a pivot point and that the burden on health and care settings could rise very quickly. Just for context, 7,000 hospitalisations a day would be 3,000 higher, yes, 3,000 higher than the deadliest peak of the pandemic last winter. This was a serious headline. Well, what's happened since last month's doom-mongering? The latest data from the official government dashboard shows that hospitalisations have almost halved, from over 1,000 a day down to the mid-600s. We can have a look at what that looks like now. Far from that large peak at the winter, hospitalisations are actually now trending downwards. Well, on the 15th of September, the same day as that Guardian headline, we had Dr. Andrew Lillicoe on this programme. He forensically took apart the weird and wild model of 7,000 hospitalisations a day. Here's some of what he had to say. He said that the way in which newspapers are reporting a lot of this modelling, indeed a way in which many television channels are reporting a lot of this modelling, is taking the most extreme models and blowing them up as if they're some kind of central scenario, when they're not at all that. I really do encourage you to look at the interview with Dr. Lillicoe on the GB News website. Well, Dr. Lillicoe went on to say that the media often alights on the most extreme scenario, as happened in this case, and he was absolutely right. We can see it in the data. Hospitalisations rose very slightly a couple of weeks ago and have been falling since. Any fool could look at this graph and see the idea that we could reach 7,000 hospitalisations this month is an absurdity. It's well worth looking at that interview. COVID cases, meanwhile, which are a leading indicator of hospitalisations, have bumped up and down with no sign of exponential growth. They're even a lot lower now than they were before our so-called Freedom Day. Enacting step 4 of the roadmap when the government did in July was absolutely right. It was timed to perfection. We're clearly in as good a place as we could hope to be. Nightclubs are open, children are back at school, and we're clearly immune enough to keep even the Delta variant bumping around rather than soaring into the hundreds of thousands of cases every day. And even though Sir Keir Starmer won't say it out loud, you could see what they really think from the Labour Party conference. Barely a mask to be seen. Labour delegates enjoying poorly ventilated drinks receptions shoulder to shoulder with other maskless guests. A crowded leader's speech with just a small smattering of face coverings. Don't believe their theatre in Parliament. Conference showed what they really think. And they're right. Now, I'm not counting my chickens here. It's prudent to keep a low-intervention toolbox just in case. But as things stand, we're in a fairly good place. Well, talking of the Labour Party conference there, so there's been some polling in terms of how it all landed, how Sir Keir is being perceived and what the Labour Party needs to do to win back trust. Well, joining me now is James Crouch, Senior Research Manager at Opinium, the research company. Welcome to the show. Firstly, shall we take a look at what the state of the polls are right now? It looks like they've been relatively stable. We have a poll of yours back from last month, I believe, that we may be able to show here. That's from around a month ago when the Labour Party and the Conservative Party were a lot closer. But since then, the Labour Party seems to have drifted down.
Well, the main thing to realise is that in the run-up to the conference, Labour Party was actually in a pretty good state. So the Tory lead was down to 3 points, which actually is the lowest Tory lead since the vaccine rollout. And that comes at the end of a period of pretty bad news for the government. The bad news for the Labour Party is that that's week after week of very bad headlines, and the Tory party is still in the lead. And the big thing that really drives that is not enough people think that the Labour Party is yet ready for government. So we only have around 29% of people thinking they are, a whacking great 48% thinking they're not. And until they start to have, well, until the government starts to have terrible headlines and people start to think, oh, the Labour Party, they'll do it better, the Labour Party won't get much beyond that.
And it's hard to think of much worse headlines that the government has had. I mean, we're having fuel bills rising, there's an HGV crisis, people can't get petrol, taxes have gone up. It's very odd to think that at a time in which there's a party conference, I spoke to John Curtis, Professor John Curtis, on my show a few days ago. He says normally around a party conference you'd expect a bit of a conference bounce, potentially people doing better, being able to get their message across, but that doesn't seem to have happened for the Labour Party.
Well, the main thing, considering how, I guess, poor the Labour Party brand is on very important metrics, such as basically whether or not they have a plan for government or a clear sense of who they are, clear sense of purpose. The main thing I think they're probably looking for is for Keir Starmer to turn his leadership ratings around. Ever since the mess up over the local elections and the by-election in May, he's gone from having net positive ratings to net negative ratings, and those have kind of bumped along ever since May. So the key thing I think they will hope for is that even though the Labour Party is probably in stage one, they want Keir Starmer to get back on track. They want him to start showing some positive numbers so that he can be the man to then resell the Labour Party back to the country.
Now, you've done some polling, I believe it's this week, asking what the public think of the Labour Party. I think we can have a little look at some of that now. Here we go, and we can see that the is Labour united? People think it very much isn't. Is Labour ready for government? Huge majorities against. Is Labour competent? No. Those are pretty damning numbers.
Yes, I mean, there are some positives to the Labour brand. I mean, they have the nation's best interests at heart. They seem to actually be in touch with the ordinary person, which is no mean feat for a political party. But as you say, there are some really big, I guess, hard numbers that the Labour Party hasn't been seen to be good at for a very long period of time, and they're still not. And that is, I guess, one of the big challenges is what? We're 11 years into a Conservative government, and they need to start changing some of those numbers around.
And that's really interesting. Looking at that graph there, at the top you saw that people think that the Labour Party probably means well, but at the bottom you saw that people don't think it's competent enough to enact the good things it may or may not believe in.
Well, that's the thing. It may mean well, but if you don't know what it's actually going to do, you don't know what it's for, it's a bit of a challenge to actually vote for it. And all the things that the Labour Party is polling quite poorly on, the Conservative Party performs well on. So the Conservative Party, rather kind of single-mindedly pursuing its agenda, is seen to know what it's about, have a clear sense of purpose. People understand if you vote Conservatives, they vaguely are aware of what they think they're getting. So until the Labour Party can offer that kind of alternative agenda, and actually Keir Starmer can describe what that agenda is, they're still going to struggle on those.
But there's some hope for Sir Keir, because you also did some snap polling off the back of his speech. I think we can have a little look at that now. Here we go. And it actually looks like it was fairly well received by the British public. There's some pretty good metrics there in terms of the positive reaction from the public.
Yes, it is. Actually, I'm not sure it was too surprising, because there are some things where he actually did very, very well. So especially coming across as caring, all the things he was saying about the NHS and his family are obviously always going to go down very, very well, and what people want to hear from him. But also the more interesting things, such as still coming across as strong, 57% said he was strong, coming across as competent. Those are all things, as we say, people don't necessarily think about the Labour Party. So if you can think them about Keir Starmer, maybe you can start to think about the Labour Party that way.
Although potentially, if you're looking at Keir Starmer sort of being the adult in the room, surrounded by his party that seemed to be a bit of a heckling, jabbering mess, maybe his personal ratings might go up, but maybe the Labour Party itself might not have done too well out of that.
Well, precisely. So as much as we found that people, basically, they didn't think the heckling was on. So broadly speaking, most thought it was unacceptable. And actually, if you ask people who you agreed with most, 3-1 it's to Keir. So in some ways, it probably actually is still quite a good week for Keir Starmer. On the other hand, when you find 50% of the people thinking the Labour Party is disunited before a conference where a shadow cabinet minister who no one's ever heard of, admittedly, but one resigns, and then you have hecklers in the hall, those aren't necessarily positive contributors to whether the Labour Party is united or not.
Well, very interesting analysis. Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing along that snap polling as well that you've done. Fascinating, really quick turnaround stuff there from James Crouch, Senior Research Manager at Opinium. Well, that's it for today's episode of The Briefing. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back from Monday at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Be sure to not miss that. Well, after the break, we'll be here with To The Point with Patrick Christys and Inaya Folarin Iman. But first, let's take a little look at the weather.